The thing they never expected to see, the one piece of enemy gear that didn't just scare them, but completely broke their will to fight. It wasn't the roar of a tank or the shadow of a bomber. It was a vehicle, a small, open, boxy machine that seemed to be in 6 places at once, doing the impossible and silently screaming the simple, terrible truth: they will never, ever run out. This is the story of 3 captured German soldiers and the American Jeep, the little steel box on wheels that changed everything they thought they knew about war. It didn't fire a single bullet at them, but it delivered the final psychological blow. You have to understand the fundamental reality of the German war effort. Everything was precious. Everything. Every liter of fuel, every sheet of metal, every spare part. Logistics for the Wehrmacht were a continuous grinding headache. They fought a brilliant, often successful war of mobility using captured enemy vehicles, horses, and their own, often over-engineered, but fragile supply trucks. Their pride lay in making do with little, in efficiency and cleverness. They felt they were the disciplined fighters who knew the true value of scarcity. They were taught that the Americans were soft, undisciplined, and wasteful, that their dependence on machines would be their weakness, that a sharp, efficient German army could cut the supply lines and the Americans would melt away. Then they met them, and the American answer to nearly every logistical and tactical problem wasn't a complex, heavy truck or a finely tuned armored car. It was the Jeep, the sheer, overwhelming reality of American abundance, encapsulated in a tiny, ugly, indispensable machine, was the first American weapon they truly couldn't beat. The Germans were experts at survival. The Americans were experts at replacement. That distinction, embodied by the Jeep, was soul-crushing. The problem wasn't the enemy's skill, it was the enemy's complete lack of worry. Our first soldier is Dieter. He was a grenadier, a young man, only 18, captured after a relentless American push in the Italian campaign. Dieter was a motorhead. He loved machines. Back home, he dreamed of working in a factory building the magnificent, complex, and powerful Mercedes-Benz cars. He knew vehicles, he knew engineering, he knew quality. When he was captured and marched to the temporary holding pens, the first thing that drew his attention wasn't the American guards or the barbed wire. It was the movement. Everywhere he looked, something small and fast was moving, a blur of olive drab, 4-wheel drive, and loud noise. He'd seen the German Kugelwagen, our open, rugged utility car. It was good, built on the solid, simple Volkswagen chassis. It was light, reliable, and fuel-efficient, but it was 2-wheel drive, and it had a small engine. It was built for efficiency, for careful usage. You used it for officers, for messengers, for light recon. You never pushed it too hard, because the engine was delicate, and if you broke it, getting parts, especially a new carburetor or a transmission housing, was a bureaucratic nightmare that could take months. It was a precious asset. The Americans, however, used the Jeep like it was a disposable tricycle, or perhaps a cheap, unbreakable tool. It lacked the elegance of German design, appearing clumsy and rough-welded, yet it was everywhere. Dieter watched them in disbelief. A Jeep would speed past, overloaded almost to the point of collapse. They would strap 5 soldiers onto it, load all their gear, their heavy Browning automatic rifles, and a mountain of supplies tied haphazardly to the hood, the roll bar, and the small trailer hitch. It would roar off-road, over massive ditches and through deep, churning mud that would instantly high-center and immobilize a Kugelwagen. It drove with a reckless, almost insane abandon that suggested the driver had never heard of a fuel shortage, a speed limit, or a spare parts list. He saw a Jeep, absolutely plastered in thick, red Italian mud, pull up next to the kitchen tent. The driver, a skinny kid who looked barely old enough to shave, wearing a slightly crooked helmet and chewing gum with loud, annoying snaps, hopped out. He didn't check the oil, he didn't clean the thick mud off the headlamps, he didn't even look at the tires, which were visibly worn. He just grabbed a crate of fresh oranges from the passenger seat and walked inside. The Jeep was a muddy, battered wreck, yet it was treated with the casual indifference of something that could be instantly replaced tomorrow without any fuss. It was an object of utility, not a precious resource. The German mindset, hammered home by years of wartime scarcity, was to conserve. Every vehicle was nursed, polished, and treated as a living thing absolutely essential to the survival of the unit. The American attitude was to consume and abuse. The Jeep was a temporary tool, used until it literally coughed up its last gear, then simply pushed into a ditch and swapped for a new one. This fundamental philosophical difference, embodied in this single vehicle, was agonizing for Dieter to watch. Dieter started keeping a mental count. In the small, square kilometer of the camp he could observe, there were always at least 6 jeeps moving at any given moment. Delivery of food, shuttling officers, towing a small trailer full of lumber, carrying a radio set. Even one he saw, with a heavy machine gun mounted on the back, being used as a crude, highly mobile armored car, a task for which a German unit would require a dedicated, expensive armored scout vehicle. It was the sheer versatility, the simplicity, and the ubiquity that stunned him. They use them for absolutely everything, Dieter told the others, shaking his head slowly, his voice laced with bewildered disbelief. They are the perfect machine, not because they are complex or beautiful, but because they are so simple, so robust, and they clearly have an infinite number of them, like locusts. He remembered the endless, mind-numbing paperwork he had to file just to get a replacement bolt for his unit's single transport vehicle. He remembered a time when they had to abandon a truck, a perfectly fixable, important asset, simply because the specialized part they needed would take 3 months to ship from the factories, assuming the factories weren't bombed. That was a tragedy, an act of war. Now he watched an American mechanic nonchalantly toss a broken axle into a scrap pile and pull an identical brand-new replacement part from a huge, unmarked wooden crate labeled only AXLES Willys MB. The crate was overflowing. Not just 1 or 2 enough to fix the day's damage, but 50 axles just sitting there, waiting for a Jeep to break. The sheer depth of the reserve was frightening. The hopelessness wasn't in the speed or the power of the Jeep, but in the monstrous, efficient logistics chain it represented. The Jeep was a constant, moving, rubber-wheeled reminder that America was an industrial superpower utterly untouched by the war's true suffering. Every bump it took, every time it was driven without care, every time it was parked, ignored, and abused, was a slap in the face to German engineering and the years of painful German sacrifice. The American soldier didn't have to worry about the Jeep. He worried about his next hot meal or the letter from home. The Jeep was just there, and that omnipresent, casual availability was the first thing that truly broke Dieter's belief in the possibility of a German victory. Our second soldier is Klaus. Klaus was a highly trained Fallschirmjäger, an elite paratrooper captured during the brutal, confusing fighting after D-Day in France. Klaus was a master of infiltration and mobility. He knew how to move fast, light, and silent, and his specialty was disrupting enemy movements and supply lines. He respected fighting power. He was sitting in the POW camp, watching the constant flow of traffic on the muddy track outside the wire. He expected big trucks, massive supply convoys, heavy tanks. He didn't expect the strange, confusing ballet of tiny, humming, 4-wheel drive boxes that zipped past with unnatural speed. Klaus saw what the Jeep allowed the American infantry to do. It gave them a level of organic mobility at the small unit level that was simply impossible for the German army on the Western Front. The entire tactical doctrine was shifted by this one simple vehicle. He watched American squads moving toward the nearby town that had yet to be cleared. His German unit had to march, every man carrying every pound of their equipment, every mortar round, every extra tin of rations. This was the mark of the tough, professional infantrymen. The American squads, they simply threw their heavy machine guns, their mortar base plates, their large backpacks, and all their extra ammunition into a Jeep and drove right up to the line of departure. They arrived fresh, unburdened, and immediately ready to fight. "They don't even carry their own packs," Klaus exclaimed to a fellow prisoner, his face a mask of outrage. "They use the machine to carry the load, and they use the machine to carry the man. They are soft, they are spoiled." The German strategy was built on a core of tough, marching infantry, supported by a few precious, slow trucks and horses. The American strategy, as Klaus realized with dawning horror, was that everyone was motorized. The infantry was not a marching force, it was a driving force. The machine had replaced the man's physical burden. It was a paradigm shift he had not been prepared for. He witnessed a scenario that perfectly illustrated this. A single jeep, driven by one corporal, would effortlessly tow a small anti-tank or field gun into position. Klaus knew that for his army, that same task would require 6 to 8 men, straining with ropes and poles, or the use of a larger, slower, and far more fuel-hungry half-track. The jeep made the small unit completely self-sufficient and highly versatile. It turned a 9-man squad into a tiny, self-propelled army, capable of moving faster, further, and carrying 3 times the firepower of its German counterpart, and all with a single, simple vehicle. Klaus had always felt intense pride in the hardness of the German soldier. The ability to endure long marches, to suffer through hunger and cold, to be superior in discipline and physical toughness. But what good was that discipline when the enemy simply drove past you, resting and reading a comic book? What good was the ability to march 30 kilometers a day when the enemy could cover 100 kilometers in the same amount of time, arrive completely rested, and carrying a week's worth of supplies? The Jeep nullified German endurance. The Jeep was not a combat vehicle, but it allowed the American to always arrive at the fight on his preferred terms. It removed the element of exhaustion and the debilitating burden of weight. It allowed the Americans to simply appear in positions they shouldn't have been able to reach so quickly because they weren't constrained by the human body's capacity for walking and carrying. He witnessed a medical scenario that shook him deeply. A call came in, a minor injury at a far-flung artillery position, perhaps 2 kilometers away. Instantly, a jeep, marked with the Red Cross, roared out of the camp. 10 minutes later, it was back, the slightly wounded man on a simple stretcher strapped across the hood, receiving care before the jeep even stopped. Quick, simple, effective. No waiting for a slow, heavy ambulance, no long, painful carry back to the aid station by 2 exhausted comrades. The jeep had saved that man's life, not by fighting, but by moving. It was utterly reliable. Klaus thought of his own unit, where a wounded man was often a huge liability, slowing the retreat, requiring 2 men to carry him, sometimes having to be left behind if the situation was too desperate. The jeep removed that liability. It gave the American soldier confidence. If you fall, the machine will retrieve you within minutes. You are not disposable. Your life is worth the fuel it takes to save you. For Klaus, the proud paratrooper, the psychological blow was the removal of the friction of war. The mud, the distance, the weight, all the things that made war hard, the suffering he had trained so rigorously to overcome, the jeep simply eliminated them for the enemy. It was a cheat. It was a machine that allowed men to fight without the fundamental suffering he had been taught was necessary for victory. The American soldier didn't need to be tough. The jeep was tough for him, and that felt like a fundamental injustice. The final, most complete psychological breakdown came from Lieutenant Fritz. Fritz was a mid-level officer. He was highly intelligent, academically inclined, and he understood tactics, strategy, and logistics better than anyone. He was captured in the Ardennes offensive, Germany's last desperate push. He was an analytical man, and he spent his days in the POW camp observing the cold, hard, logistical reality of the American enemy. Fritz knew that wars are won by supply, not just by fighting. He had seen the war lost on the Eastern Front due to lack of fuel and spare parts more than a few times. But what he saw in the American camp defied every logistical rule, every principle of efficiency he had ever been taught. The jeep was not just a utility vehicle. It was a loud, running, industrial statement. Fritz began to count them, not just the ones in use, but the ones in storage. He discovered an immense motor pool hidden behind the main compound. There, lined up in neat, regimented rows, were literally hundreds of jeeps. Some were new, still bearing the fresh factory paint. Others were battered, waiting for repair. But the most shocking thing was the sheer ratio of vehicles. For every one heavy truck, there seemed to be 3 or 4 jeeps, all sitting there, waiting their turn. "They are like insects," Fritz scribbled meticulously in a small notebook he had managed to keep, his handwriting neat and precise. "They are small, they are everywhere, and you cannot crush them all. For every one you destroy, 3 more appear." He watched the parts operation next to the motor pool. A vast, long tent was dedicated entirely to Jeep spare parts. Not just the critical items like engines and chassis, but everything. Fenders, windscreens, seat cushions, full transmission assemblies, and yes, those towering crates full of new tires and axles. The tires were new, thick, and perfectly molded. They weren't recycled retreads. They were straight off the factory floor in Ohio or Michigan. The Germans were fighting for every scrap of rubber. The Americans simply had more than they could use. Fritz compared this to his own desperate situation during the Ardennes. They were desperately siphoning fuel from abandoned civilian vehicles, melting down non-essential metal for new ammunition casings, and praying that the few precious new vehicles they had wouldn't break down on the icy roads. The American Jeeps, meanwhile, burned fuel at a high rate, were driven aggressively, and if they broke, they were either repaired immediately with new parts from the unlimited supply tent or simply pushed off the side of the road, and a brand new one was driven in to replace it within the hour. Fritz saw the waste, and it was the most sickening thing of all. A Jeep was overturned in a shallow ditch near the camp entrance. Its front axles snapped, a fixable problem certainly with a few hours' work and some welding. Instead of sending a recovery crew, the Americans simply pulled the useful bits, the radio, the tools, the spare fuel can, and left the rest. They had too many to worry about salvaging one. The sheer, deliberate, casual waste of resources, a concept utterly alien to the resource-starved German army, was the final crushing truth. He understood then that the Jeep wasn't just a good vehicle, it was a cheap vehicle. Its simplicity, its basic, almost crude design meant that the vast, secure Ford and Willys factories in America could churn them out faster than the German army, even with its famed ingenuity, could destroy them. It was the perfect war machine for an industrial giant, disposable, rugged, and available in endless, sickening supply. The genius of the American war machine, Fritz realized, was not the advanced tank or the jet engine they were scrambling to design. It was the ability to take the most basic, essential need of a modern army, mobility and supply, and mass-produce it to the point of absurdity. This was not a weapon of war, it was a weapon of manufacturing. The officers, the enlisted men, the messengers, the medics, the machine gunners, the engineers, everyone had their own Jeep or easy access to one. It was the great multiplier. It turned the American army from a slow-moving mass of men into a highly mobile, highly flexible, unstoppable machine that could outflank, outmaneuver, and outlast any enemy. Fritz sat back and watched the sun set over the camp. A Jeep drove past, the driver humming a silly, cheerful tune, the smell of high-octane gasoline briefly wafting through the air. He thought of his generals, brilliant men, planning complex maneuvers with limited fuel and agging vehicles. He thought of his men, brave and disciplined, marching for days only to face an enemy who had simply driven to the battlefield, their weapons and supplies riding comfortably beside them. The war had been lost long before the first shot was fired in Normandy. It had been lost years ago, on the factory floors of Detroit, where millions of these ugly, simple, perfect little boxes were being built, not with the meticulous, artisanal care of German engineering, but with the ruthless, overwhelming efficiency of American mass production. The Jeep was the ultimate, cold, hard proof that they were fighting a ghost, a nation whose reserves were so bottomless, whose logistical power was so vast, that they could afford to treat the machine of war as a disposable convenience. The realization that their own brilliant, efficient, and careful use of limited resources was utterly irrelevant in the face of this overwhelming industrial abundance was the thing that finally, completely, extinguished the light of hope in Lieutenant Fritz. The Jeep didn't carry bombs or bullets. It carried the truth, and the truth was simply too heavy to bear. The stories of Dieter, Klaus, and Fritz all circle back to the same point. It wasn't one single, clever invention that won the war for the Americans. It was the way they used their industrial power, perfectly personified in the simple, four-wheeled Jeep. The Jeep showed them that American mobility was constant, versatile, and inescapable. It proved that the American infantry was unburdened, always rested, and always supplied. The simple act of effortlessly moving across a landscape was the weapon, and the sheer visible number of them, in every compound, on every road, and on the scrap heap, proved that this logistical power was backed by a nation that would never, ever run out of anything. The German soldiers were trained to fight a war of skill and survival, of cleverness and endurance. They found themselves fighting an industrial superpower that had turned the very movement and supply of an army into a disposable commodity. The machine was doing the work, and the man was simply along for the ride, and that was a sickening, infuriating realization. That noisy, bouncing, four-wheel drive rumble of the Jeep wasn't just an engine's sound. It was the chilling, final tally of the American factory. It was the sound of a well-fed soldier who knew if his vehicle broke, he'd get a new one by sundown without any paperwork. It was the moment these men realized that their entire struggle, the sacrifices, the hunger, the meticulous rationing of every part and drop of fuel, it had all been a desperate, futile effort against a force that operated on a scale they couldn't even comprehend. The psychological warfare was unintentional, but total. The American soldier didn't need to try and break the German spirit with propaganda. He just needed to drive his Jeep, carelessly, quickly, and with absolute confidence in the endless supply chain behind him. The evidence of his nation's limitless power did the rest. The sight of a discarded Jeep was more demoralizing than a destroyed tank. Don't just watch history. Subscribe for more hidden stories from the front lines.